Our speaker for tonight is also our new team member, Clare, who's joined us from Canberra, moved up here October last year, and since become part of our team. And Clare has a background in astronomy. Her interest began at age 9 with a visit to the Sydney Observatory and one look at Betelgeuse through the eyepiece, and she was hooked, she says. She decided then and there to be an astronomer, and she's proud to have procured several positions in the field despite her lack of formal qualifications in the subject. She's also been researching UFOs for over 35 years and has had many personal sightings, starting with her first at age 2. Always interesting when someone with that background has their own experiences, yes. So in 1984, Clare joined the Canberra Astronomical Society and subsequently spent 10 years on the committee, and she's participated in the Society's school program, public viewing nights, observation programs, and also developed and ran training courses on the Oddie telescope at Mount Stromlo Observatory. Later in 92, she joined the staff of the Canberra Space Dome and Observatory as an astronomer, where she ran observatory sessions for the public. Same year she formed UFO Research in Canberra, and I used to see her name come up on before Facebook. There was the old email list, and she'd be on the international list that I was on then, with all the well-known researchers. In 93, she joined staff of Sky and Space magazine as assistant to Jonathan Nally, and also worked for Southern Sky magazine as the editorial assistant. She joined the Road City Astronomers as astronomer and lecturer, joined the staff of Electro-Optic Systems to document their telescopes and work on development of a satellite laser ranging system for the purpose of earthquake detection for Tokyo Bay. In 96, she was appointed as assistant to the director of the CSDO, and the next year became a regular presenter on ABC Radio 2CN with a segment called Radio Telescope, where they discussed all things astronomical and also talked about UFOs. And that ran for 18 months, and that must have been very interesting, very interesting. Also been a dinner speaker at the Australian National University, co-founded and appointed the treasurer of the Australasian Planetarium Society, appointed as a head astronomer and planetarium manager of the CDSO, and was first woman in Australia to be appointed to run a major astronomy and space education facility. And in 2017, she first became aware of the electric universe theory and has been researching it ever since. So Clare is here tonight to talk about the electric universe. So please welcome Clare Williams.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you. Yes, I've had an interesting career, and probably one of the few people that you will ever hear who's worked in astronomy who is prepared to admit to having seen UFOs. It's something that when you work professionally in an industry like that, you don't normally talk about, and I was one of the few people that openly talked about it. It didn't necessarily win me many fans, but the public were always really interested, and whenever we had the UFO talks on the little radio segment that I was involved in, we always had callers backed up. You know, we could never take all the callers for the people that wanted to phone in and discuss things. The electric universe is also another one of my heresies, I suppose you could say. It's not something that most people that work in astronomy and space education would admit to having an interest in. And yet, as I will talk about a little bit later on, there's an awful lot of open questions in the standard cosmological theories, and most people that work in astronomy and astrophysics and cosmology know that. And if you talk to them in private, they will even tell you what their own little heresies might be. But it's really not okay to talk about it in public. So I'm kind of breaking that taboo here tonight. I'm actually talking about it in public. So I've tried to pull these two things together, the electric universe and UFOs. Not sure how to make this work.
The bottom.
The bottom one, is it?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. So the talk will briefly be an introduction to the main tenets of the electric universe theory. But before that, we're going to talk a little bit about standard cosmology, because unless you understand what the standard accepted cosmological models are, it's hard to understand the difference between that and the electric universe hypothesis. And then we're going to have a look at some things that have occurred to me that might be possible UFO phenomena that never seemed possible under the standard cosmological model. It was always been too easy to say, well, that can't have happened, because it's against the laws of physics or whatever. However, it depends on what you think the laws of physics actually are. And in light of the electric universe theory, there's a whole bunch of phenomena that have been observed for decades in UFO cases that might become more readily understandable. There might actually be explanations. So we'll have a little look at that. And then if we've got time, just talk briefly about what I think might be, a basis for UFO or spacecraft propulsion systems using tenets from the electric universe. So we'll start off having a little bit of a look at the universe according to the standard cosmological model. And so as you can see here, we've got that it's believed that it resulted from explosion of a singularity in an event known as the Big Bang, and I'm sure you've all heard of that. Anybody that hasn't heard of the Big Bang's probably been hiding under a rock for decades. It's believed that the universe is somewhere in the vicinity of 13.8 billion years, although that age seems to fluctuate, give or take 500 million years. And the primary evidence that's given for that is the cosmic microwave background radiation. And I don't know if there's anybody here that has not heard of the cosmic microwave background. If you haven't, I'll explain it to you. But it is, one of the things that's always put up as evidence of the Big Bang. The other thing that's put up as evidence of the expansion of the universe, and hence is also considered evidence for the existence of the Big Bang, is redshift that's observed in the light coming from other galaxies or galaxies outside the Milky Way, and I'll give an explanation of exactly what that is later on. So the standard cosmological model universe has the following properties. It's considered to be expanding. It is currently considered to consist of 4.9% ordinary matter, which is stuff like you, me, planet Earth, what is referred to as baryonic matter, stars, planets, gas, dust, charged particles, 26.8% dark matter, and 68.3% dark energy. Whatever dark energy actually is, because they've not actually been able to find any evidence of dark energy, but it is supposed to make up 68.3% of the universe. Then we have gravity is alleged to be due to the bending of space-time by masses such as stars and planets and galaxies. And we had a situation where a team from an organisation called LIGO recently announced, within the last few years, announced the discovery of gravitational waves. Well, that is questionable, but you probably won't hear too many people talk about that. So we'll talk a little bit now about the standard model of galaxy formation. And galaxies are thought to be formed by gravitational collapse of hydrogen and helium, which are the two lightest elements in the periodic table. And they believe that hydrogen and helium was the only type of elemental matter produced from the Big Bang, with anything heavier than helium actually being produced either inside stars or as a result of supernova explosions. And it's thought that the first galaxies formed no more than about 12 billion years ago. Galaxies are thought to grow and evolve through mergers with smaller proto-galaxies, which are normally considered to be kind of like small amorphous blobs, and then they merge to form spiral galaxies, and spiral galaxies in turn they think merge to form larger elliptical galaxies. And it is currently thought that galaxies typically contain supermassive black holes at their centres. So that's the current idea about galaxy formation. Galaxies with active galactic nuclei. Now, these are galaxies that are observed to have, they think, supermassive black holes in the centres that have, jets of materials streaming out from them. These jets are thought to be produced by strong electromagnetic forces created by matter swirling towards a supermassive black hole. Now, how gravity can generate electromagnetic forces is not explained. Okay, what is a star? In the standard model, stars are balls of hydrogen and helium with enough mass that they can sustain nuclear fusion at their cores. They are created by condensation of hydrogen and helium from clouds of cold molecular gas induced by gravitational collapse. So the idea is that in space there's all this hydrogen and helium kind of just floating around, and through gravity, which is the weakest force in the universe, it somehow gets attracted together to form, larger masses, and in turn the larger masses merge, and gravitational effect induces angular momentum, and this causes accretion disks. So the conservation of momentum from the movement of all the particles in the cloud causes the whole cloud to begin to spin, and as it spins it heats up. As the gas collects together, it heats up. When the density at the centre of the cloud reaches a certain point, the heat produced initiates nuclear fusion. Oh, sorry if you can't hear me. Stars evolve through a complex process dependent on their initial mass. Low-mass stars end their lives as white dwarfs, while high-mass stars end their lives with supernova explosions. And it's currently thought that a star can't go supernova unless it's got at least 1.4 times the mass of our sun. So our sun is never likely to end its life in a supernova. We don't have to worry about that. The surface of the sun is stone cold compared to its core and corona. The temperature of the core of the sun is thought to be in the millions of degrees, as is the corona, estimated at around 15 million degrees, while the temperature at the surface, which is called the photosphere, is only around 5,000 degrees. The reason the corona is hotter than the photosphere is not understood. Planetary formation. Now, according to the standard model, planets are formed from the same fundamental nebula and accretion disk as the parent stars. The protoplanetary disk model assumes that the planets were formed largely where we find them now. And that is that planets don't migrate in their orbits. If a planet is formed close to the star, it stays close to the star. It doesn't normally kind of wander out further out into its solar system. It's thought that the rocky inner planets formed from denser material that was attracted towards the centre of the system through a series of violent mergers, while the gas giants form beyond what is called the frost line, which is basically where water can't exist as a liquid. The early solar system was a violent place, and the young planets were subjected to prolonged periods of bombardment, resulting in the cratering we see today on many of the bodies in our solar system, including the Moon, Mercury, Mars, and the satellites of just about all the planets we see. Now, there is a number of problems, and I haven't listed them all here, with the standard cosmological model, but I'll just talk briefly about some of the main problems. The first point that I've made is that all the matter in the universe is compressed down into a singularity, supposedly, a point of infinite density, pressure and temperature. However, a point by definition does not have any volume, so it cannot contain anything. Now, it's also interesting that this is not my work, this is the work of somebody else who's done a lot of work on the maths of all of this. Has pointed out that something that, can't contain anything and has no volume, how can it have a pressure? And if it contains no matter, how can it have infinite temperature? Because temperature is a result of matter vibrating. But yeah, be that as it may, this is the stuff that Stephen Hawking would have us all believe. More than 95% of the universe is comprised of dark matter and dark energy, but no experiment yet devised has been able to detect the presence of either. They've spent hundreds of millions of dollars looking for evidence of these things, and every experiment thus devised has failed. Gravity is supposedly caused by the bending of the fabric of space-time, this is according to Einstein, by mass. However, what is space-time? Space-time is, according to Einstein, nothing more than a mathematical construct consisting purely of 4 dimensions: length, height, width and time. It's a coordinate system, it's nothing more. No one can explain what the fabric of space-time actually is. It's often referred to as, the bending of the fabric of space-time. Well, what is the fabric of space-time? Whatever it is, it's not a rubber sheet. But that is what all the diagrams that you see that talk about, illustrate the bending of space-time, all depict it like it's a rubber sheet with a ball in the centre of it, and it kind of shows how the rubber sheet bends. Not a good analogy. There is no definition of mass in relativity theory. The word seems to be interchangeable with matter, but matter and mass have completely different properties. The mass of a body allegedly increases with acceleration, but the amount of matter in it does not. Redshift is assumed to be due to recession of the emitting body. Now, I mentioned before that I would talk a little bit more about redshift and explain what that is, and we will come to that. But the big question is that may not actually be true. The cosmic microwave background is assumed to be the echo of the Big Bang. The radiation released at the time of the Big Bang redshifted into the microwave end of the spectrum, but is it? There's other possible explanations for that. So I said we'd get to some definitions, and here we are. Cosmic microwave background. Now this is electromagnetic radiation thought to be the remnant of an early stage of the universe in Big Bang cosmology. The CMB is also variously known as cosmic microwave background radiation or relic radiation. The CMB is a faint cosmic background radiation filling all of space that is considered an important source of data on the early universe because it is supposedly the oldest electromagnetic radiation in the universe, dating back to what is referred to as the epoch of recombination. Now, the epoch of recombination is the time when matter was really first forming and the universe became what is referred to as being transparent. I'm not going to go into it. Really all you have to understand is that astronomers think that this is a radio signal that is being picked up that is due to the Big Bang, and that this signal is being now redshifted into the radio part of the spectrum. And the accidental discovery of the CMB occurred in 1964 by American radio astronomers Arnio Penzias and Robert Wilson. and it was the culmination of work initiated in the 1940s, and it earned them a Nobel Prize in 1978. Redshift. Okay, this is one of the big bones of contention. Redshift is akin to pitch in sound. So we think in terms of redshift in light or blue shift is akin to pitch in sound. So, when you hear the sound of something coming towards you, the sound seems to start off low, and as it comes towards you, the pitch gets higher and higher, and then as it moves away from you, the pitch gets lower and lower. Well, it's thought that the same thing happens with light, and that as an object is coming towards you, the light waves get shifted towards the blue end of the spectrum, and as it's moving away from you, the light waves get shifted towards the red end of the spectrum. Here we can see a normal spectrum. Here we can see something that's redshifted, and you'll see that these lines, which are called absorption lines, appear to be moved further down towards the red end of the spectrum. And here, where it's blue shifted, those same spectral lines are moved further towards the blue end of the spectrum. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about red or blue shift. Dark matter. Dark matter has gone through several evolutions in the idea of what it may or may not be since I've, worked in astronomy. When I first was working in astronomy, the concept of dark matter was starting to come about, and it was initially due to observations made by a woman astronomer named Vera Rubin, and she was looking at galaxies, and she was using redshift and blue shift in the spectra of galaxies to try and identify their motions and how the stars in them were working, moving. So she was producing these things called galaxy rotation curves, and what she noticed was that the stars in the galaxies didn't seem to be rotating in quite the way that they should have according to the model. And it was postulated that this must be due to the fact that there was more mass in the galaxy than we could actually see. So, we were used to looking at galaxies in the visible part of the spectrum, and we could see what was known as, all these stars and everything, what was showing up in our optical images. But it appeared that, no, there's not enough mass. So the big question was, where is all the missing mass? And so there were two ideas as to what the missing mass might be. We knew it wasn't luminous, self-luminous matter like galaxies and like stars, sorry. So perhaps it was dark matter, and it could be things like just planets, and they're not bright enough for us to be able to detect them. The other thing was that it could be just lots and lots of particles, and they referred to these things as weakly interacting massive particles, or WIMPs. So you had two varieties of cold dark matter. You had MACHOs, massive astronomical compact halo objects, which were things like large planets and that sort of thing, and then WIMPs, which were the particles. And then you also had the idea that there was this high energy randomly moving particles created soon after the Big Bang, which was termed hot dark matter. So that's basically the story of the search for dark matter. So basically it's just matter that can be seen by its gravitational, that can't be seen, but its gravitational effects are observed. Later on, the idea of dark energy was postulated. And dark energy is some unknown form of energy which is hypothesised to permeate all of space tending to accelerate the expansion of the universe. Dark energy is the most accepted hypothesis to explain the observations since the 1990s, which appear to indicate that the universe is expanding at an accelerating rate. Now, this was something that they just couldn't understand. Why did everything appear to be moving away from us faster than it should be? And that this seemed to constantly be accelerating. So, there were a whole bunch of ideas put together for this, and they really couldn't understand how, what force could there be that is actually causing this apparent repulsion, matter repelling itself, having a repulsive effect rather than an attractive effect. So the diagram I've got here just shows what they think happened and how the expansion of the universe has changed since the Big Bang. The main problem with dark energy is that, once again, lots of experiments have been devised to try and detect it, but they've all been unsuccessful so far. So, what are the main core issues with the standard cosmological model? So, no one really understands what gravity is. It is supposed to be the weakest force in the universe. It is supposed to be always attractive. It is supposed to be responsible for the accretion of matter into nebulae, stars and galaxies, but it cannot impose rotation and it cannot cause matter to accrete into a disk. These things are just against the laws of physics. But not according to some cosmologists and astrophysicists. There is more than one interpretation of what causes redshift. It can be recession of the emitting body. This is referred to as Hubble's law. The velocity of an object away from the observer is assumed to be approximately proportional to its redshift. And so this is one of the main methods that's used to determine how far away extragalactic objects are. They look at its redshift and then they try and determine its recessional velocity based on that. And they compare that to a series of a type of stars that are referred to as standard candles. These are Cepheid variables. I'm not going to go into what a Cepheid variable is, but they are assumed to always have a constant brightness. That's another assumption that's not been proved, but we won't go into that. Gravitation. Another possible cause of redshift is gravitational effect of light escaping from a strong gravitational field. This is referred to as gravitational redshift. The expansion of the universe. This is referred to as cosmological redshift. An intrinsic property of the emitting body, and this is referred to as quantized redshift. There is more than one interpretation of the origin of the cosmic microwave background. So according to most cosmologists, it's just remnant radiation from the Big Bang. However, water molecules in the Earth's atmosphere also emit at the same wavelengths. And the equipment that was used to do the detections never took that into account. There's other observations that have been made from points outside the Earth's atmosphere at a point in the Earth's orbit known as one of the Lagrange points, and the observations taken from there do not detect the same radiation. So there are a whole lot of problems in the assumptions that were made about the cosmic microwave background. Not to mention that the pretty pictures that they produced all had to be fudged to remove the foreground radiation from our own galaxy. And they claim to have been able to see really, really faint residual radiation that was coming from behind the galaxy. And there was too much noise. They couldn't really do that. There was lots of fiddling with the data took place. Another one of the main issues is there's no real proof that singularities or black holes actually exist outside of mathematical models and computer simulations. Yes?
Wasn't there something in the news just recently where they said they found evidence?
Oh, they claim to have imaged something that they call a black hole. Yes. But there's another explanation for what that probably is. Yes, we've never actually, apart from that one claimed observation, where they took an image that, once again, very highly manipulated. No, that's the only evidence. You know, they claim to see motion and stars around the centre of our own galaxy that they think indicates the presence of something very massive there, which they think is a supermassive black hole. But, you know, there's really good evidence that says that all the mathematical modelling that's done around black holes is fundamentally flawed. And they really are just a mathematical construct. The speed of light has been observed to be neither a constant nor a cosmic speed limit. It varies according to the medium it is passing through, and there is good evidence to suggest that information, and gravity at least, can travel faster than light. That cannot be accounted for in the standard model of physics, and this is why Einstein referred to a lot of quantum entanglement, what's referred to as quantum entanglement, as spooky action at a distance. He couldn't really understand how it could happen. Okay. Now, I've sat in many astronomical conferences and sat and listened to many talks by world-famous astronomers and cosmologists, and heard them talk about how, you know, with all the things that we observe, we need a new physics. And that was a catch cry all throughout the 90s. We need a new physics. We need a new physics. The funny thing is that they're really reluctant to look at alternate models. They're very happy to play around and tweak the existing models, but they really don't want to throw them out. You know, there's too many papers, books, you know, reputations built on all of this stuff. So, you know, there's been a huge reluctance to seriously look at anything else. However, an alternate theory has steadily been gaining ground, and it's commonly referred to as the electric universe or plasma cosmology. And so we're going to take a look at that now. So I started off here with just a few electric universe responses to the problems with the standard cosmological model that we just looked at. The first thing is that according to EU theory, there are no such things as singularities or black holes. These are purely mathematical constructs, and it is not legitimate in maths to divide by zero to get infinite anything, which is what Hawking did, I'm sorry to say, including density, pressure and temperature. The objects currently observed and presumed to be black holes are what are referred to in plasma cosmology as plasmoids. And in particular, these are plasmoids in dark glow mode. There is no such thing as dark matter or dark energy. These are purely hypothetical and were devised to account for the flat rotation curves observed in galaxies and the apparent acceleration of the expansion of the universe. Gravity is electrostatic in nature and a bipolar force. Now this is key. It is akin to magnetism and can both attract at short distances and repel at greater distances. So that's why it's referred to as being bipolar, because it can attract and repel, just like magnetism can. So, you know, that accounts for the apparent acceleration. You know, you don't need dark energy to account for that. There is no such thing as the fabric of space-time. There is only the ether, and it was a mistake to do away with it. Mass is a measure of the amount of energy stored in matter, which explains the equation E equals mc squared. Very famous equation, I'm sure we've all heard of it. And we think that it came from the genius of Albert Einstein. Sorry, it didn't. It came from Henri Poincaré and Einstein pinched it.
Who did it come from? I didn't catch it.
A French astronomer, or a French physicist, sorry, by the name of Henri Poincaré.
Okay, thank you.
Redshift and blueshift are both intrinsic to an object and are not a measure of acceleration away or towards us. It is most likely due to an effect known as electromagnetic retardation. The cosmic microwave background is caused by the emission of microwave radiation from water molecules here on Earth. It's got nothing to do with anything in the cosmos outside of our atmosphere. So what is the electric universe according to, what is the universe according to electric universe model? You know, the electric universe doesn't claim to have all the answers. It claims not to know what the origin of the universe was. For all we know, it's always existed. So its age is currently unknown. The evidence that is used as the primary source of evidence for the electric universe are the plasma filaments, which have been observed between galaxies. And this is something that has stumped cosmologists for a long time, ever since they've started to do the first large-scale surveys of the galaxies. They noticed that galaxies seem to form into this sort of, along filaments and into this weird sort of structure, and they couldn't really account for it because it's not something that gravity would do. So they could never really account for the filamentary nature of what was observed. However, the electric universe has an explanation for that. The properties of the universe are thought to be static. That is, it's not actually expanding. It consists of 100% ordinary matter and energy, stars, planets, gas, dust, charged particles, otherwise referred to as plasma, and electricity in the form of Birkeland currents. Gravity is not the bending of space-time, it's an electrostatic effect. So what is plasma? Plasma is usually described as being the fourth state of matter, but EU theorists suggest that it actually should be thought of as the first state of matter. So this is when atoms are highly ionised, they're very energetic, and they're capable of carrying electric charge. So plasma is a state of matter in which an ionised gaseous substance becomes highly electrically conductive to the point that long-range electric and magnetic fields dominate the behaviour of the matter. The plasma state can be contrasted with other states, solid, liquid and gas. Plasmas are by far the most common phase of ordinary matter in the universe, both by mass and by volume. Plasma can exist in three states. Dark mode, which is, as I referred to before, the plasmoids in dark glow mode, and probably what we think black holes are. Glow mode, which is what we observe in the corona of the sun, and in what are referred to as emission nebulas. This is an emission nebula here. This is the sun. So that arc mode is also what we see in lightning. We'll talk a little bit about Birkeland currents, because Birkeland currents are not normally something that is taught. I never heard of them in all my years of studying until I came across electric universe theory. Birkeland currents were named after a Norwegian scientist, Christian Birkeland, and it refers to an electric current in a planet's ionosphere that follows the magnetic field lines. These are also referred to as field-aligned currents, and they are used to describe any field-aligned electric current in a space plasma. They are caused by the movement of a plasma perpendicular to a magnetic field and manifest as twisted filaments of plasma with alternating cylinders of rotation. Now, these are now thought to be what causes the aurora. So the aurora borealis and the aurora australis here on Earth, and the aurora that we see in other planets, including Jupiter and Saturn. So, galaxy formation. The plasma universe may be eternal and infinite, directly contradicting the Big Bang model. Swirling streams of electrons and ions form filaments that span vast regions of space, and these have been observed. We've got lots and lots of images. Hubble Space Telescope took thousands of images of these things. Where pairs of these filaments interact, the particles gain energy and at narrow pinch regions produce the entire range of galaxy types, as well as the full spectrum of cosmic electromagnetic radiation. Now, this has been proved in the laboratory. There's a whole science of plasma physics, and this is all, thoroughly understood. Galaxies lie along filaments on a large scale, as they are observed to do in those images that we talked about. And the bulk of the filaments are optically invisible from a distance, but are detected in radio frequencies. And this is an area that is often, I'm sorry to say, been neglected in cosmology. They just haven't really looked at a lot of the radio information that's come out, and I've had a few friends who've been radio astronomers, and they do really wonderful work, but somehow a lot of it just never seems to make it into standard cosmological thinking. Galactic jets result from particles being accelerated by collapsing magnetic fields. And there's a little diagram up here, and I'll see if I can use the pointer without changing the slide. So here we've got our plasmoid, and there was a really nice little video, but I really thought, no, I don't have time to show that, showing the collapse of a Birkeland current to form a plasmoid that was done in a laboratory experiment. But you can see that the plasmoid is kind of a torus shape. And down here, we've got a series of images. Now, these are not real photographs. These are computer simulations that were done by plasma physicist by the name of Anthony Peratt. This guy is not a crackpot, as a lot of standard cosmologists would have you believe. Anybody that thinks that believes in plasma cosmology or the electric universe is a crackpot. Anthony Peratt is a very senior plasma physicist. He's worked extensively out of Los Alamos laboratories in Nevada, and this guy really knows his stuff. And he's run a series of computer simulations which trace the development of spiral structure in two interacting plasma blobs over a span of nearly 1 billion years. And his simulations have basically mirrored every observed shape of galaxy that we've seen. What is a star? We talked earlier about what the standard cosmology thinks a star is, a big ball of gas, hotter in the centre and, with nuclear fusion going on at the core. In the electric universe model, stars are considered to be something quite different. They're an electrical phenomenon and rely on their electrical environment for their mass, appearance and classification. They behave as electrodes in a galactic glow discharge. So for anybody that's done any sort of electrical engineering, stars are thought to be anodes. Their cores do not burn with a thermonuclear fire, and they are much cooler than the hot plasma discharge that envelops them, which is referred to as the corona. And that's the white thing that you can see in that image up there. Stars are formed like beads on a string by what are referred to as Z-pinches along galactic filaments of plasma and neutral hydrogen, which are basically Birkeland currents. The galactic currents that create the stars persist to power them. So the stars are formed like plasmoids, as we looked at that image of the plasmoid. And so, that's effectively the way stars are considered to form. The matter inside stars becomes positively charged as electrons drift toward the surface. The resulting internal electrostatic forces prevent stars from collapsing gravitationally and occasionally cause them to give birth by electrical fissioning to form companion stars and gas giant planets. So that's a completely different approach to how stars are thought to form. Now, just a little additional note there. The sun is stone cold compared to its corona. That is why the interior of the sun, seen through its sunspots, is much cooler than the electrical storms that rage above it in its photosphere. The bright plasma shell of a star, particularly giant stars, may be much larger than the solid core that is the focus of the cosmic discharge. Stars and gas giants may occasionally reduce internal electrical stress by ejecting some of their charged core, usually equatorially, in a nova-type outburst. Now, we've seen these sort of outbursts have been observed for decades and thought to be due to matter from binary stars, being matter falling onto the surface of one star from another, although stars are not actually supposed to have a surface. And then, that causes some sort of outburst. This has been the traditional explanation for nova. However, nova don't always occur in binaries, so, how can you explain that? The light curves of nova show that typical rapid onset and slow decay of lightning. The result of the outburst is an expulsion disk and closely orbiting companions. So that is what the EU thinks a star is. And I'll just quickly go on to planetary formation. Planets are considered to be born at intervals by the electrical ejection of charged material from the similarly charged interiors of larger bodies. They can be either gas giants or stars. So thought that gas giants form from stars, or they might also form out of the same Birkeland current through a different C-pinch, and rocky planets from gas giants. They may also be formed from condensation or knots of matter along collimated jets of material formed by powerful electric discharges from stars. And this is something that has been, these things are known as Herbig-Haro or HH objects, and they've been noted for probably about 3 or 4 decades, and nobody really understood what Herbig-Haro objects were. But, this is a nice explanation of what a Herbig-Haro object probably is. The electromagnetic pinch effect will produce a jet of matter, rather like a coronal mass ejection, only on a much grander scale. And the result is a protoplanet plus a stream of gases and meteoric debris. A star may also capture a large body, a planet or a system of planets around another star, and this will initially cause chaotic rearrangement of all those bodies. That chaos involves electrical charge interchange between the bodies, which produces the cratering and other scars on planets and their moons due to electrical discharge effects that machine their surfaces and eject material into space. The best examples of these effects can be observed today on the Moon and Mars. And recent history of the solar system. The electric universe also incorporates information extracted from the mytho-historical record. This is ancient myths and legends to show that the solar system was quite different in our recent past, that is within the last 10 to 20,000 years. It proposes that Saturn was originally a dwarf star with Earth and Mars, its 2 largest satellites. The system was captured by our current sun, and following much chaos and electrical discharging, Saturn settled down to becoming gas giant planets. So it's actually thought that Saturn was a small brown dwarf star or red dwarf star, and it had a retinue of planets. It was effectively a Herbig-Haro object, and it got captured by our current sun. Now, after a whole bunch of electrical interchanges, Venus was ejected from Saturn during the process, and the finer material settled into orbit around the planet as the ring system. And there is very good evidence to suggest that Saturn's ring system is actually quite young. It can't have persisted for billions of years. After some close approaches, the Earth, Venus and Mars eventually assumed their present orbits. Part of that chaos in the solar system resulted in the electrical machining of bodies, particularly Mars. And I've shown again here a picture of that Valles Marineris. Now, material kilometres in depth has been removed from the northern hemisphere of Mars and ripped from the giant scar, Valles Marineris. But no one can really tell where that material went. But there's very good evidence that the northern hemisphere of Mars, the crust in the northern hemisphere of Mars is much thinner than the crust on the southern hemisphere, with no real good explanation in the standard cosmological model for that. The asteroids and comets in our present solar system are thought in EU theory to be made up of this material which was ejected from Mars, primarily Mars. And I've just made a little note at the bottom here to say that EU theory does not support the idea that the asteroid belt is the result of an exploded planet between Mars and Jupiter. That idea just doesn't really hold much water. What are the indications that the electric universe theory might actually be right? First one is that we still receive meteorites from Mars. And there've been a lot of them found, and we know that they come from Mars because they contain gases that look like the atmosphere of Mars. Venus is inexplicably hot and appears to have a very young surface, and this is something that NASA scientists and planetologists just can't explain. They put it all down to volcanism, but there's a whole bunch of things around Venus that are really anomalous. It's super dense atmosphere, it's young surface, which once again it doesn't actually show evidence of volcanism. It shows more evidence of electrical scarring. Saturn's ring system was actually predicted by electric universe theory, and there's no good explanation for the ring systems in standard theory of planetary and solar system formation. Saturn, the Earth and Mars all share very similar axial tilts. So what is meant by that? That is actually, how the Earth's axis is tilted at 23.5 degrees to what we call the plane of the ecliptic. So it causes our seasons. Well, Mars and Saturn share very similar axial tilts. Asteroids show features that are expected from matter which has been differentiated by processes on a planet. Now, what does that mean? That means that when we look at the rocks, and there's been several missions to asteroids now that have returned samples. And just last year I was talking to a chap who was one of the mission scientists from the mission that recently returned samples from Ryugu. I think it was pronounced Ryugu. And he was talking about how, look, it shows olivine and it shows this and it shows that, and we don't know how these materials form because they're normally found in planetary crust. So, they don't really understand where this material came from, because it requires planetary processes to produce these things, volcanism and even evidence of sedimentary rock. I couldn't believe that one. How do you get sedimentary rocks on asteroids? Comets are not actually dirty snowballs, and neither do they appear to be primordial, which means that they don't appear to be remnants left over from the formation of the solar system. And they, we've heard for decades, and this was the explanation that I accepted myself for a very long time, that when you look at a comet, the reason it has that bright tail is because the comet itself is like full of ices, and when the comet gets to a certain point in its orbit and those ices start to heat up and they outgas, and that's what produces the tail of the comet, and it always points away from the sun. But when we've actually now had missions that have got close to comets and looked at them, they're not dirty snowballs. They look just like asteroids, and they don't appear to have ices in them. They're made of rock. So how do you account for that? Electrical discharge phenomena are also scalable, and laboratory experiments are able to replicate planetary features such as Olympus Mons, crater chains, craters with central peaks, scalloped crater edges, dendritic rills and valleys. How easy it is for skeptics to dismiss UFO sightings and other paranormal phenomena simply because it doesn't fit in the existing paradigms. So, they can't figure out what the mechanisms are behind it, and so therefore, it can't exist, and so it's very easy to just ignore the whole thing and write it all off. But that may not be the case if we accept the electric universe paradigm, because there may be some options to explain some of the phenomena that traditional physics really can't explain, has no explanation at all for. They'd rather just not know about it. So I'm going to look at a few of the observed phenomena, and some of these will be well known to most of the people in this room. If you need a little bit more information about what I'm actually referring to here, just put your hand up and I'm happy to take questions through this part of it. The first one I'm going to talk about is the bending of light beams in the vicinity of UFOs. And I don't know whether anybody here is, I think quite a few people in the audience here would be familiar with the Burke's Flat UFO case. Put your hand up if you're not familiar with it.
It's in the latest issue of UFO Encounter. By the way. Okay, well this was a case that occurred in a tiny little place called Burke's Flat in rural Victoria. And I can't remember you might be able to tell me the year that it occurred in, but I think it was back in the 70s. Can't remember.
It was investigated quite thoroughly by Bill Chalker. And one of the effects that the witness was really stumped by was something that he noticed with his car headlights, because he was driving along this rural road, pitch black, and he observes this bright light off to one side, and he thinks it's a farmer working late at night, with agricultural equipment in the field. So he's just driving along, and this is a route that he regularly drove. And all of a sudden, he comes around a bend and he can see that this light in the field is getting brighter and brighter, and he doesn't really pay that much attention to it until something really weird starts to happen with his car headlights. And they apparently get bent at an angle towards this light in the field. And then he notices that his whole car seems to be getting pulled in the same direction. And he has to stop his, fight hard to keep control of his vehicle. And he keeps travelling, But he also observes this object, and he realises that it's not actually a piece of agricultural equipment. It's this really weird light phenomenon that's going on with these oscillating columns of light with spinning discs and things. And I've got a photo, or an image, it's not a photo, taken from an episode of the TV series Close Encounters. And that's a little grab of the image that they simulated here for the bending of the car headlights. So here's the car here and the headlights, and this is the effect that he reports of the car headlights kind of being bent off towards this object in the field. Now, in traditional physics, there is no explanation for an effect that can cause light to bend in that behaviour. The only explanation that I am aware of would be a change in density of the transmitting medium, which would cause refraction, an effect known as refraction of the light. And that's the effect that you see, you know, if you put straw in water and the straw appears to bend, it's because the light is bent by the water. There's a difference in the refractive index, it's called, between air and water. So a difference in refractive index is about the only explanation in traditional physics that can account for this particular phenomenon. But there may be an alternate explanation in electric universe theory, because according to electric universe theory, it's possible for refraction of light to be caused by high energy electrostatic charges and magnetic fields. That's what I think was probably occurring during this particular case. The object that he was observing in the field was generating a very strong electrostatic field. And that caused, it's an effect known as ionisation, and it would affect what are referred to as the dielectric properties of the medium. And I've just got a little explanation down here of what a dielectric is. A dielectric or dielectric material is an electrical insulator that can be polarised by an applied electric field. Now, there's different nuances of the term dielectric in electric universe theory, and it probably depends on who you talk about, because this really isn't settled science. But you know, there's really no such thing as settled science anyway. But yeah, a change in the dielectric properties will cause refraction, and it has been observed in the laboratory for external electric and magnetic fields to affect the path of electromagnetic waves, and light is just an electromagnetic wave, provided that the medium is partially or fully conducting. So that's why I think what has happened in this instance is that object has ionised the air, which has made it electrically conducting. And that's what's caused this particular effect. But, you know, it's my speculation. But I just wanted to point out that, you know, there is a possible explanation for this effect, and I believe it's been observed on more than one occasion. The Burke's flat case is probably the most famous, but I think there are other instances where this same effect has been observed in the...
In fact, there's one that's probably more interesting in as much as the light emanating from the UFO is like a piece of rope. It stops and they can lengthen it and shorten it.
That's the next effect I'm going to talk about. Okay. So, here we go. Solid or liquid light. So, as Colin was just saying, yes, this has been observed on numerous occasions. And this image that I've got here is actually out of that same episode of Close Encounters, and it's their representation of the object that was causing the bending of the headlights. This is what he reportedly saw in the field. And the behaviour of this particular object, and you have to really watch it, and the episode's up on the UFO Research Queensland YouTube channel, so if you haven't seen it, I recommend you go there and you watch it. It's really fascinating. So yes, this object, these light columns were observed to be moving around and oscillating up and down, and then this disc-like object at the top was observed to slowly move down until it merged with this one at the bottom, and then they all kind of just disappeared. So, really weird, I really don't want to speculate too much on what this might have been, except that I think that the whole thing about solid light is something that probably does have an explanation in electric universe theory. And what I've basically said here, that some EU theorists suggest that matter is nothing more than a condensate of the ether, and that light is nothing more than a perturbation of the ether. So what we're talking about here is nothing more than the ether. If this is the case, solid light should be a state of the ether somewhere in between. So, that's my hypothesis of what this is. And interestingly, when I was researching this, I came across a website that reported to cases where something that they now refer to as frozen light or crystalline light having been produced in the laboratory. And the interesting thing about this is that they produce it using room temperature semiconductors, but they really don't understand how it gets produced. So they don't understand the causative mechanism behind it. And, but they know that it occurs, that they talk about crystalline lattices being set up in the light. Now, yeah, that to me is really, really interesting. And this is something that probably goes back to how the spectrum of stars is manifest, but I really don't want to go into that because that's a whole talk on its own right. But yeah, there's mechanisms that are thought to be due to crystalline lattices in the sun, and that really can't occur if your sun is a ball of gas. But yeah, the whole idea of these crystalline lattices in light is really interesting, I think. So another thing that I think that might be explicable in terms of EU theory is material that's been observed to just kind of like drip off objects. And I personally investigated a case in Canberra back in the early 90s, and I've tried to mock up what the witness said they saw. And they lived on the slopes of Mount Taylor in Canberra. And from their backyard, one afternoon, this was broad daylight, they were having a barbecue, and they noticed this object just drifting across the sky in front of, Mount Taylor. And they described it as looking like a golden coin turned up on its side, and kind of rotating around with what looked like, they said it looked like liquid metal dripping off it. And they observed this object for several minutes. It wasn't something that, was just over in a flash, and it was quite physically large. Because when I investigated it, I thought, well, perhaps it was, like garbage bags with flares or something, because there were a whole lot of hoaxes going around at that time, where people were hoaxing with this sort of thing. But this didn't accord with what they reported. And I actually went up and I hunted around looking for evidence of this material, because I thought perhaps some of it might have made its way onto the ground, that there'd be some sort of ground traces. Could never find anything. I spent probably 2 afternoons looking under what I thought should have been the path that the object took. But then the witnesses said that they couldn't be sure whether the material actually made it directly down to the ground or not. But yeah, I know that there's been quite a few other cases where similar sort of effect has been noted. And when I was putting this particular presentation together, and the section where I talked about electrical fissioning on stars, it kind of sparked something in me, and I thought, yeah, perhaps that's what's going on here. So that perhaps what was observed here was a hot plasma discharge due to strong electrostatic fields, or electrical fissioning of matter, and as I've said there, as in stars. Yeah, but I think it's more likely to be some sort of plasma discharge effect.
Like
yes.
ball lightning?
Similar to ball lightning, yes, because that also is a plasma discharge. Yeah. Okay, another one that most of the audience here have probably heard of, falls of angel hair. Anybody here not heard about cases of angel hair? And so we've got a couple of people. Okay, there have been a lot of accounts of this going right back to Fatima, Portugal, in 1917, when you had all those witnesses, witness the apparition of the Virgin Mary. And that apparition was accompanied by falls of this material that's been referred to as angel hair. And it's typically a white, stringy substance that seems to persist for a short period of time, and then it kind of dissolves or evaporates. And another famous case was in Oloron in France, and that's the image that I've used here, which is an image that was produced, an artist's impression based on eyewitness accounts of what occurred there in France. And we can see that what they reported were these reddish coloured spheres that had like a gold disc around them, and they were emitting this white filamentary substance, which you can see here, which is referred to as angel hair. And this substance drifts down to the ground, and it may persist for a little while. In some instances, when it's been reported, it appears to dissolve immediately on contact with the ground or with trees or something like that. In other instances, it seems to persist for a while, and some people have tried to get samples of it so that they can take it to a laboratory for analysis, but I'm not aware of any case where the material has persisted for long enough to get it to a laboratory for it to be analysed. If anybody knows otherwise, please let me know. Skeptics typically put it down to, spiders' webs. But yes, to migrating spiders that spin webs and that sort of thing. But yeah, spiders' webs, they don't just dissolve like that. So my hypothesis about this, and this is just purely my speculation, is that this is a formation of something that I'm going to refer to here as proto-matter, much as I hate that term. But it's some sort of matter-like substance that I think gets formed in strong electrostatic or electromagnetic fields. And the filaments are formed and will persist in the vicinity of the field, but will decay on contact with normal matter. And I think that this is probably due to a loss of charge. So I think the material is highly charged initially, and it forms these filaments, possibly, like Birkeland currents, these, spiralling filaments of electromagnetic energy. And, so it starts to form, but there's just not enough energy in there for it to actually form into permanent matter. And so it as it discharges, it just evaporates. Another interesting phenomenon is the pendulum or falling leaf motion. And I personally observed an object performing this behaviour, would have been back in the mid-70s. And I was travelling with some family members. We were driving between Sydney and Canberra, and we'd just come out of Picton. I don't know if anybody here knows that area of New South Wales very well, but we were just coming up the hill out of Picton, and I observed this object. I was not driving, I was a passenger in the back of the car. I observed this object through the window, and it was off to the east. And at first I thought it was just a small plane. Didn't pay that much attention to it until the motion kind of I caught it out of the corner of my eye, and then I started to look at it. And what I detected was that it seemed to be moving like this, like a wave. And I pointed it out at that stage to my mother, who was driving, and my grandfather, who was in the front passenger seat. And we pulled over to try and get a better look at it. And when we pulled over, the object had reached a point, it would have been around Wilton or Appin, that area. In fact, the Hume Highway now probably goes right through the area where this object apparently landed. And it just it'd been doing this sort of motion, and then it kind of came to a stop, and it was doing this rocking motion for a bit, and then it just kind of lowered itself down like that and disappeared into the trees. And we tried to find a way, a road to take us down to that direction to get a better look. Couldn't find a way through. It was just all forest. So, yeah, this is the sort of behaviour that I'm talking about. And it's been observed for decades. This particular diagram that I've got here it's very hard to read the text because it's a photocopy of a very old document, and the resolution's not good. But this is from a military witness who observed this kind of spiralling or corkscrewing falling leaf motion of this object or series of objects. It was more than one. Now, I've wondered for a long time about this effect, and I believe this was also that skipping along, like wave-like motion that was observed by
Kenneth Arnold.
Kenneth Arnold, thank you, yes. And because he observed these objects moving along as if they were skipping along like a stone on water, or a saucer on water, and that's what gave rise to the whole term flying saucer. So that's the motion that he observed back in 1947. But what I think that this might actually be is due to something, and this is going to sound like a real mouthful, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think it's due to a propulsion system which generates a reciprocating precessional magnetic field. Tim's nodding. Now, in EU theory, magnetic fields are understood to generate a force, which is typically referred to as the Lorentz force, which follows what is referred to as the right-hand rule. Now, this is actually what causes magnetic fields to spiral or corkscrew. And it's probably the whole reason why DNA is helical, and it explains things like, you know, the tendency for everything to kind of grow in spirals according to phi. And we know that this Lorentz force is the thing that causes the braiding observed in Birkeland currents. So I suspect that it's got something to do with this reciprocating precessional magnetic field. Thoughts on UFO propulsion? So I've been thinking about this for some time, and I think it's pretty much undeniable that UFO propulsion systems have to be based on electric universe principles, and that is that these principles are that everything in nature is electric. There's only space and counter space. Everything can be in one of two states. It can either be in a state of charge or discharge. And so charge, when we think of it in terms of magnetism, is attraction, and discharge is repulsion. Space is magnetic divergence from the still point. And sometimes we'll hear people talk about something called the still point of light. I don't think that that's quite correct, but what we're talking about is just the ether at rest. And counter space is that still point of inertia or rest. So that's everything in the universe. It's being acted upon by a force, and it's out of equilibrium, and it's seeking that rest. And gravity is negated through discharge, while charge is used to either land or direct motion in any desired direction. That's the way I think these electromagnetic propulsion systems work. So I've got another slide here. And anybody that's been around this place for long enough will recognise exactly what this type of craft is. It's the typical Adamski scout craft, scout ship. A diagram that was done by quite a famous physicist by the name of Dr. Thomas Townsend Brown. Some of you may have heard of Townsend Brown. Others may be unfamiliar with him. But he took this stuff seriously enough to spend a lot of time working in the laboratory to try and duplicate this effect. And there are videos on YouTube of Townsend Brown's experiments over time. It was all recorded on film. Townsend Brown thought that these things were generating an ion plasma vortex, a toroidal plasma vortex. And I think he was probably on the right track. What I think these things are, and I've just made a comment here that UFOs have frequently been observed to employ 3 balls or hemispheres, or sometimes they're just lights. And, you know, some of the more recent UFOs, such as the black triangles, which appear to have these 3 red lights, you know, one in each corner of the triangle, I think they're probably performing the same function. And what I think these things are actually capacitors in a ring circuit. And that what they're doing is generating a variable electrostatic field which is strong enough to generate lift through negation of gravity. And I think that this would work equally well in planetary atmospheres and in the vacuum of space. And I think the reason why you need 3 as a minimum, you could probably have more, Yeah, you need to be able to stabilise, and you need to be able to put a field, you know, direct it, have some ability to direct the motion. So I think 3 is probably the minimum that you require, but you could probably have more. And that's what I think these things actually are. Just to give you a little bit more information about who the main proponents are at the moment of the electric universe theory. One of the main ones is this chap up here, Waltham Hill. He's actually an Australian, and I had the pleasure of meeting him and having lunch with him. Very interesting man, actually quite brilliant, I think. And he's a classically trained physicist, but he was inspired by the work of Immanuel Velikovsky. One of the other originators is a chap by the name of David Talbot, and he's an American author and mythologist. And he too was inspired by Immanuel Velikovsky. But he looked at it more from the perspective of, you know, what does the mytho-historic record tell us? He's done a lot of work on trying to put together the ancient myths and how they might be explained by electric universe theories. And one of the other shining lights is this chap down here, Don Scott. Now, Donald Scott is an emeritus professor of electrical engineering who has written textbooks on electrical engineering. This man is not a crackpot. You know, you can't get any more mainstream than a university professor who writes the textbooks. And this guy is now one of the major proponents of the electric universe theory. And very interesting work on Birkeland currents. For anything else?
And we've run out of time.
We've run out of time, so thank you very much.